Hi, this is Reda Sadki from the Geneva Learning Foundation. What happened to partnership work? It used to be we would get together physically with people we know, we would spend time with them, we would grow trust and relationships, and that was how we grew partnerships. Very rapidly, we've now come to a situation in which all of a sudden we're working with people we've never met physically. We're learning to trust them, figuring out how to use the tools to actually work with them effectively. This we call the digital transformation of partnerships. And in this presentation, I'm going to be sharing some of my insights from the Remote Partnerships Workshops and from the Scholar Partnership, which is the conjunction of the University of Illinois College of Education, the Geneva Learning Foundation, and Learning Strategies International. Together, we've been developing a vision for new learning and assessment, really rethinking what the digital transformation means for learning, education, and training for humanitarian development and global health work. And the vision that we have would be a new learning system in which learners can do all of these things. Create together, give each other feedback, share what inspires them, what they discover through their work. And really, this is not about some nicer, kinder, gentler kind of learning. It's really what are the core competencies that humanitarian workers need to have, and can we make the way we learn and we work through this digital transformation model that, actually relate to that, and help us deliver results better and faster. So in preparing for the Remote Partnership Workshop, I thought I'd try to think through what does that vision look like and what does it mean? Is it relevant for remote partnering? This is what I came up with. This vision of partners creating together, giving each other feedback, making diversity productive, helping stir reflection. All of those seem to me to be very important and actually relate back directly to some of the dilemmas and challenges that we're facing around through the Scholar Partnership. First and foremost, we have to do away with digital dualism. So in order to explain this concept and what it means, let me introduce you to Nathan Jurgensen. I'll ask you, you can answer the question if you're watching this on the screen. Have you used Snapchat in the last 30 days? So it's an application which you can answer. You can send each other sort of video messages and that then delete themselves. So it's also a lot more than that. And Nathan within Snapchat is actually kind of their resident philosopher and thinker about what the digital transformation means. And he in 2012 openly began to question this idea that in real life was somehow inherently superior to what we do online. And he pointed out that actually that is a myopic view that is preventing us from really thinking through in the most useful ways how we manage the fact that we are living in an augmented reality that exists at this intersection between what is material, what is information, what is physical, what is digital. Basically what happens in a Skype call is just as real as what happens in a face-to-face workshop. And there's this constant penetration of digital and offline, and that's what we need to think about. Once we start thinking about it that way, it's no longer about remote partnerships. It's about how partnerships are being digitally transformed, and what that actually means. And what this idea of digital transformation was first used by industries that were going from a physical medium, say the record industry, to digital files, MP3s, where you had infinite replicability, and all of a sudden you had a change in business models. We think the same thing is happening to learning, education, and training, and there's a good chance that some of the same sort of dynamics are occurring for for partnerships, and in particular for remote partnerships. So what is changing? And here are 5 things. Digital dualism is one of them. So questioning that, so moving away from digital dualism is really important. But then we also have performance, scale and access, applicability, diversity, and complexity. So allow me to go through these, and then we're going to circle back later in the presentation to look at how, in the context of the Scholar Partnership, we've been able to resolve these dilemmas, to actually gain and take away 4 rules for the digital transformation of partnerships. So where do we start? We start with performance, right? This is about work. This is about getting results in humanitarian development and global health work. This, of course, is the holy grail. Perfect coordination, kind of perfect partnership in which all the partners, all the players just operate at a very high level. Each one knows their job, each one coordinates with the others. This is what we want. How do we get there? What kind of model, how does technology just enable or support getting there? Second is scale and access. So we know key challenge is how do we work with people at scale. In the past, we built these elaborate pyramids of organizations. And so at the global level, you had very few organizations that could claim some legitimacy in representing people in different parts of their respective pyramids. What if we could scale up to include every person working in every community, every organization working at the local level, moving away from the pyramidal and inevitably hierarchical views and models of the past? Next is expertise. In that same vision in which we empower local communities, local players, who's the expert? What does it mean to be an expert? Does the expatriate model of the the delegate who's deployed to a country to bring his or her international level expertise, is that still a valid model? And if not, then what can possibly replace it? What does it mean to be an expert when working together, when collaborating from distance? And how does technology sort of change that is really what we want to be asking. Applicability. So in training specifically, applicability is a problem. We know you spend 50,000 on a workshop. At best, people will be able to sort of take away and apply and transfer 10% of what they learned to their actual context of work. So how do we improve that? How do we make the learning process, the partnering process actually more directly relevant to delivering results and being able to embed that process into work itself, into partnership itself? Next is diversity. So this, obviously in this vision in which we have every person empowered to collaborate, to contribute to a network, to contribute to a partnership. How do we deal with differences across geography, but also between vulnerable groups, within different, so people are positioned in different places in the system in terms of experience, and so on and so forth. So that's another key challenge. An aircraft carrier is so complex that there is no operating manual. No one actually, has the book that tells you how to run this thing. And yet it operates as a high reliability, high performance organization. So that shows it's possible. That's one possible takeaway. But it should also lead us to think, how are we moving away from command and control models in our partnerships, in our learning initiatives, in order to connect people in ways in which they're continuously improving themselves, even though it may be so complicated, so complex that there's no way to get the big picture or to prescribe what that big picture should look like. And in order to sort of understand some of these other changes, we have to look at the underlying sort of processes involved with the nature of knowledge itself. So a lot of remote partnership work is going to be about knowledge flows. And what happens when things change so fast, faster than we can sort of process, interpret them, put them into a database, develop, and when the knowledge is sort of this fast-flowing river, it's a process, not a product. I think that's one of the key considerations we have to think about to move away from schema in which we think that we can somehow capture all of the knowledge, box it in, and make it available to share it with a network or with a partnership. The other thing is at the individual level, Robert Kelly's been looking at knowledge workers since the mid-'80s. In 1986, if you were a knowledge worker, 75% of what you needed to do your job was right there in your brain. By 2006, that was down to 10%. So 90% of what you need to know in order to do your job, which may include partnering effectively, it can only be done by accessing knowledge that's in other people and increasingly in other machines. So the quality of the pipes in the network is really key to determine your ability to work effectively and deliver results. So that leads to 5 learning problems that can also be sort of rephrased as partnership problems. How do you move from strategy to implementation? How do you put reporting practice to use? How do you document experience to develop case studies, that are sort of significant, authentic enough? And how do you relate? How do you connect the dots between that diversity of experiences? How do you foster collaboration across silos? And when you issue that global guideline, how do you bring that to life? How do you make it relevant and useful to people working at the local community level? So here is a pedagogical model for new learning that I believe to be very relevant to the context of partnership. This is actually, in fact, what good teachers, so brokers, and so which you can think of as a kind of partnership brokers, have been doing all the time. Which is, if you're a good teacher, you want to give recursive feedback and tell your kids, if they're kids, your trainees or whatever, how they're doing as they work. You don't want to wait until the final test. Similarly, in a good partnership, I would imagine that you would want recursive feedback between the members of the partnership. You would want the members of the partnership to be actively making knowledge. You would want them to collaborate with intelligence. You would want them to be thinking about the partnership as it evolves and it develops, so that it's really being continually improved and being continually relevant, and recognizing that not all of the partners start from the same place, that they have different interests and needs, and making sure that how you work, how you partner, how you learn, how you share, recognizes all these things, and can also be done at any time from any place. So these are the affordances, the 7 affordances of new learning, and they're relevant now. Rather than trying to sort of connect the dots, I'm going to give you examples of real-world initiatives being done by the Scholar Partnership and a number of key partners that actually operationalize this framework and resolve some of the 5 dilemmas that I worked you through a bit earlier in this presentation. So this is the Digital Facilitator Initiative, working with War Child, a Dutch NGO, and specifically the Lebanese Country Office of War Child. There are a lot of complex concepts that I've walked through: the digital dualism, the digital transformation. We make it very basic. We know we need a practical approach. So we first ask, what is the problem? Second question is, what does a solution look like? Yes. And third, if we get success, what does that actually look like? What is success in this context? So those are the 3 basic questions in the Scholar approach. And with Digital Facilitator, again, we're not trying to figure out how to facilitate a WebEx session. That may be one of the outcomes, is an improved ability to do that. But ultimately, initially what we're interested in is this transformation that we're going through with facilitation, where increasingly you're doing it remotely, but it's sort of a tacit process that no one has really examined. So how does that work when most people learn through experience? How do we change the culture, and how to make sure that, to at least have an understanding of what we're losing through this transformation, as well as what we're gaining? So there are dozens, hundreds of facilitation skill courses. Here are some of the issues we've identified with some of them. There's also some excellent ones that can be used. But this is not about offering a course which is a container for knowledge. This is about recognizing that knowledge is very dynamic, that there are limitations to conventional facilitator training, and that, in fact, what we propose to do is to build facilitation competencies by relying on the experiences of those who have to figure out how to facilitate in a variety of contexts. So if you're a village volunteer in South Sudan, your context may involve facilitation with local community leaders, with vulnerable groups within that community, but it's also negotiating the relationship and the communication with folks back at headquarters, back at the head office. How do you do that? How have you learned to do that? And how can you learn to do that better is basically what we want to do. And we want to do it through a very simple 4-week process in which people will not have to stop work in order to learn, in which they will be able to develop their own contextualized guide for facilitation in their own context. So whether it's that village volunteer in South Sudan, she will develop the guide that's relevant to her context. But of course, she will be doing it working in collaboration through peer review with other people in the system in other contexts, and they will be learning from each other. So by the end of the 4-week process, we'll have dozens, potentially hundreds of context-specific guides for facilitation developed by people who actually have the experience of that context, And from that, the organization will be able to gain perspective on what a global curriculum that recognizes that diversity and leverages it as something productive might actually look like. So at the same time, the existing quality standards, guidelines, frameworks will be part of the scaffolding for learners to develop their context-specific guides. Furthermore, through this kind of community ignition process, there will be people who emerge, who rise as top performers and leaders who will distinguish themselves, and they may not be the people whom you expect to distinguish themselves. So that's how we resolve access and scale. So what does success look like? In Digital Facilitator for participants, I've mentioned what it looks like for the organization. For participants, they're going to walk away with a guide that they can use in their work and can share with their colleagues or with the person who will be taking over, that they'll be handing off to when they move on. They'll be learning from the rich diversity of context across barriers of geography. And then they may gain access to the top performers, may be invited to face-to-face events. You're pointing again to the cultural and social value of such events. So let's go back and look at how this initiative and one other called the Ambulance course resolves these dilemmas that we looked at earlier. So another separate initiative of the Scholar Partnership, working with Norwegian Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the IFRC, has been to develop a course for ambulance and other pre-hospital emergency workers. So over the course of 4 weeks, we had over 800 participants join the course, develop over 70 case studies of very clear, specific documentation of situations of violence and risk of violence, including a lot of tacit knowledge of experience that had never been shared before. And they did it by talking to each other, engaging in dialogue and peer review. So Jean-Marie, the Burundi bush doctor, his ambulance is a Cessna 206 worked with the Filipino nurse in Baghdad, whose ambulance is a medevac helicopter, talking to their buddy in the Philippines, who's waiting for a new typhoon that's going to hit the country and getting his ambulance ready, talking to a lady in Toronto who's working on preparedness for mass casualty incidents. So all of a sudden, building that community of action, which was the initial problem that we wanted to solve, had a sort of practical approach that could support it and enable it at distance across a distributed global network in ways that we could have never conceived of doing before. Very impressive sort of amount, volume, and quality of knowledge production. These case studies that documented situations that had never been documented before. And at the end of the day, at the end of this community ignition process, these pre-hospital emergency workers expressed a strong interest in further collaboration, even though they were complete strangers initially, and there are sort of wide differences from one context to another that could have been, say, excuses or legitimate reasons for not seeing the point of collaboration. So what we did in the ambulance course was project and problem-based learning, really focusing on how people make what they learn, the process of it, as well as the outcome relevant to their work. So in this case, it meant very simply, very practically, can you document a case study in which you were confronted with an incident of violence or the risk of violence and analyze that incident? We don't just want to know what happened. We're actually interested in what you think happened, why it happened, and how you could make sure it never happens again. So that is how we resolve scale and access. There's no upper limit to the number of participants in the partnership or the initiative. We use peer review to scale. So peer review builds connections between participants, and they are ultimately producing something tangible that they can use in their work, that can be used to certify or assess the quality of of their capabilities, and that also builds connections to between participants. That also helps resolve the dilemma of expertise, because we actually need very little time from established experts in pre-hospital emergency care, because we're leveraging the experience of participants, and where we do need expertise is to develop the rubrics, so the set of criteria that are then used to enforce the standards and the guidelines that the course team takes responsibility for. Now that Scholar process is really has 3 steps. It's write, then review, then revise. So you first take ownership for something you develop. It could be, so it's a project, it's a problem you have to solve. You may develop an action plan, you could do a case study. Whatever it is, it's something that's tangible and meaningful to your work, and meaningful and making it sure that it's also meaningful to the people that you're working with. So that's step 1. You take ownership for that. And then you go into peer review, in which you're giving feedback and you're also going to receive feedback. And when you receive that feedback, you move to the revision stage, which is what you've learned from the first 2 steps. You then go back and look at what you initially produced, and inevitably you're going to see things that you can improve. And that's the point of doing the self-review. And ultimately you may want to share with the community what you have produced if you feel it's good enough, and if it's actually validated when there's a need to do so by the course team or the people taking responsibility for the overall process. So this is not just so that there's a sequence of peer review and knowledge development, which is very powerful, but it's part of a broader learning and feedback ecology. So there's all kinds of things happening at the same time in this Scholar approach process, in which we're actually stimulating all of the things we described in our initial vision for new learning and assessment, and is extremely relevant to the vision for remote partnerships, which is just making sure that there are all 7 of the affordances of new learning and assessment. Just being able to work anywhere, anytime, giving feedback, getting feedback, being able to put that knowledge to use, working on something that's meaningful and relevant, and that forces you to think about what you're doing. Ultimately, that ecology supports and scaffolds all of that process in a very pragmatic way. So here are the 4 takeaways, 4 rules for the digital transformation of partnerships. And this, I'll let you think back and connect the dots to how the different examples I've provided, the different concepts actually support each of these rules. First of all, sharing physical space is no longer a condition to partner. So that's actually what changes. Yes. Now, what people actually do depends on what we can afford to do, very often literally, but also what we perceive as being valuable. And that value is very much cultural, related to the social relations that we have with members in a network, members in a partnership. And those are the kinds of things we need to think about. The 4th one is and this is actually key, is the pace of change for what we can do when we're connected outside of a shared physical space. That's changing faster than we expect it to. So going from and the changes, some of them are positive, some of them are negative. We need to keep on top of them to stay current, and we need to open and embrace that change in order to improve the quality of the connections and therefore the quality of the partnerships. So I hope these 4 rules can be useful as guidelines, or just or to as a heuristic to help you think through of how in your own context your partnership work is being affected by the digital transformation. And if you are already at the stage where you're working in a remote partnership in which you seldom, if ever, get to meet physically with the participants or the stakeholders in the partnership, think about what these 4 rules mean, and in some cases it may lead you to realize that that in fact there may be a benefit to meeting in a shared physical space and making the investment that entails of moving bodies and materials to a shared physical space so we can meet. So those are 4 rules. They're not prescriptive. They're intended for you to help you think through the underlying issues. This has been a presentation by Reda Sadki of the Geneva Learning Foundation for the Remote Partnerships Workshop. You can learn more about the foundation and its work on our website, www.learning.foundation.